Welcome back to the King's Corner, the place for all things Bethesda. I am the KingFanMan. We're back for another Scary Places in Fallout 76, and this is the 9th in the series. And this one you're either going to love or you're going to hate because it's completely different. We are going to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and you just better hold on because this one, it's going to get crazy. Point Pleasant, West Virginia is in Mason County where the Ohio and the Kanawha rivers come together. It is a small, quiet town of under 5,000 people. Quiet, that is, when you look from a distance. But when you start to look deeper into this town, and especially into its history, it starts to reveal a much darker and stranger aura. The quiet country town literally takes on a life of its very own, unlike any other anywhere in the world, complete with Indian curses, nuclear fallout, demons and angels, paranormal creatures, UFOs, spirits of all kinds, and human catastrophes. Now, obviously, that's a lot to cover, but I will do my best. Point Pleasant began as a military camp and was established by Colonel Andrew Lewis in 1774. He came here on word from George Washington, who had traveled through this area in 1770, and reported it as a great land abounding with buffalo and wild game of all kinds. Shortly after the initial settlement of Point Pleasant, a battle broke out on October the 10th, 1774, on the future site of the town. The Battle of Point Pleasant, what many historians say, was the very first battle of the American Revolutionary War. But it was not fought between the British and American troops, at least not primarily. After being compelled by Britain to do so, Camp Point Pleasant was attacked by two tribes from the Shawnee and Mingo Indians. They were led by famous Indian Chief Cornstalk. After a furious and bloody battle, Cornstalk and his troops retreated, but not before 81 Virginia militia lay dead and over 100 more lay wounded. The Shawnee and Mingo carried away their casualties, so no one knows exactly how many had died, but many say more than 200 warriors from the Indian tribes had probably met their end. Peace would be a long process between the settlers and the Native Americans, and sadly, what happened to the great Cornstalk several years later certainly did not help matters. In 1777, Cornstalk and his son came to the fort at Point Pleasant, apparently to talk peace. However, the soldiers at the gate, maybe not knowing what else to do, put them in a holding cell so they could go get their superior officers. About this same time, a group of men came into the fort who had a very horrible run-in with some Native Americans who had actually killed one of their group, maybe even a family member. When these men found out that Cornstalk and his son were in the fort in the holding cell, they flew into a rage. Even though Cornstalk and his son had nothing to do with the murder of their family member, it didn't matter to these drunken soldiers. Their hurt had turned into hatred, and that hatred was now not just for the murderer, but for any and all Indians. How very sad. So the soldiers entered the cell and became what they hated so much, a murderer. And it is reported, as Chief Cornstalk lay dying, the chief put a 200-year curse on Point Pleasant. The words that he spoke were reportedly these: "I came to the fort as your friend, and you murdered me. You murdered by my side my young son. For this may the curse of the Great Spirit rest upon this land. May it be blighted by native and nature. May it even be blighted into its hopes. May the strength of its people be paralyzed by the stain of our blood." Many believe that it is truly cursed today. Now, if we are to truly believe that Point Pleasant is cursed for 200 years, then we must see some major evidence that will set this town apart from 1777 to 1978. Well, let's look at just a few pieces of evidence. I mean, sure, there have been fires, floods, tornadoes, and explosions, but we need things that are really different. The bones of Chief Cornstalk still lay in the grave today. They do lay in a place of honor, with a 12-foot monument erected, but this has not stopped the curse. Well, let me start by telling you about another monument in town. It stands 86 feet tall, compared to the 12-foot monument erected in Cornstalk's honor. This 86-foot tall monument was dedicated in 1909. It was already behind schedule when the month previous it was supposed to be dedicated on a clear night. Out of a mostly starry sky, the sky erupted with lightning, and lightning struck the crane that was going to move the monument in place. It was severely damaged. It took almost a month to repair. They finally got the monument in place and dedicated, but again on July 4th, 1921, lightning struck the monument, damaging the capstone and some of the granite blocks. So what is this obelisk that seems to attract lightning out of a clear sky? It's just the monument to the men who died in 1774, the Battle of Point Pleasant, when Cornstalk was defeated. Now, before we get to the meat of this video, let me mention a few of the tragedies that have hit Point Pleasant. In 1907, on December the 6th, the worst coal mine disaster in American history hit Point Pleasant, where 310 men lost their lives. In 1944, 150 people were killed in a tornado that ripped through the tri-state area. Of course, in 1967, on December the 15th, the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people. In 1968, a Piedmont Airlines plane crashed, killing 35 people on board. In 1976, in March, an explosion rocked Point Pleasant in the middle of the night, killing 5 people. In 1978, in January, a freight train derailed at Point Pleasant and dumped thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals, contaminating all the town's water supplies and wells. And then finally, in April of 1978, 51 people were killed in an accident at the Willow Island power plant. Now, those events are certainly horrific, but not nearly out of the ordinary. However, we aren't nearly done with Point Pleasant. During World War II, the U.S. government chose Point Pleasant and the surrounding Mason County to be the home of a secret igloo project, which had that name because of their shape. It resembled an Eskimo's igloo. Now, these igloos were very hard to see from the air, and they were made this way to be hid from the enemy. The government bought over 8,000 acres of land near Point Pleasant to build a high explosives manufacturing plant and acid plants, and hundreds of these igloos to store the materials from these plants. All of this was done, of course, as a top secret project. At the end of World War II, there was no need for the plants anymore, so the U.S. government made 3,000 acres the McClintock Wildlife Preserve, and all the plants were abandoned. But the igloos remained. Some had been leased out by the government to store all kinds of things, some still with the TNT and high explosive and acid from World War II, some even with suspected nuclear waste. By the 1980s, it was fully acknowledged by the EPA that the igloos were leaking. And also, many of the pipes from the plants are still underground, full of chemicals, with unknown effects to the people and wildlife. Rumors of mutated animals and fish from the area are very common still today. But just how mutated? On November the 12th, 1966, there were 5 men digging a grave near a small town 85 miles from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and they heard rustling in the treetops. And then all 5 men witnessed what they called a brown flying man. They said he flew from the top of the trees low over their heads, and then he was gone. Now, you can't find much more about that first encounter. I guess no one paid much attention to those first 5 guys until it happened again. Just 3 days later, on November 15th, 1966, 2 young couples from Point Pleasant, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Millette, told the police that at 11 p.m. they were driving by the TNT plant and saw a man standing in the road, Linda said it looked more like an angel with huge wings, 10-foot wings. It was kind of gray, but it had large red eyes. So they turned the car around and left at over 100 miles an hour. But the creature started chasing them. They said it followed them almost all the way back to town. They could hear it on the top of their car. When they turned on Highway 62 to go back into town, he was standing on the road waiting on them. And as they passed him, she said he went straight up like a helicopter and continued to chase him. Finally, he veered off into a field. The reason the police said that they believed the 4 witnesses is because, first of all, when they first got to the station, they were terrified. And secondly, and most importantly, the officers split up the 4 and made them write down their reports separately, and each wrote the exact same report. In the following days in Point Pleasant, those same type sightings became routine. 2 volunteer firemen who saw it said it was a huge bird with red eyes. Now, once it was obvious that this was a real thing, and with such large numbers verifying its existence, the local sheriff and the professor at the college had to say something. So they commented that they believed it must be due to a large mutated bird of some kind, maybe a large herring, or even a mutated crane or owl. But the people of Point Pleasant were insulted by this. They knew what they had seen, and they knew that no amount of mutation could explain some of the things that people were reporting. The people that were seeing it the closest were saying it looked human. It was only those who saw it from a distance that said it looked like a big bird. Plus, the way it acted, the way it flew. So many things about this being just don't add up to a bird. No one really wanted to say it, but some were whispering it was supernatural. Could a demon be loose in Point Pleasant? One chilling description from witness after witness might just point to such a thing. Along with the red eyes, another very common description was it had the face of a man. Once the newspapers picked up on the stories, it wasn't long before an anonymous copy editor gave this creature or being the name the Mothman, which was a spin-off of the famous comic book character the Batman, which had a popular TV show at the time. The name is obviously a misnomer because he is not at all moth-like. In fact, the people of Point Pleasant, the locals around West Virginia, they simply call him the Bird. In the next few weeks and months, the sightings totaled into the hundreds, and all described him almost at 7 foot tall, with a 10-foot wingspan, with fiery red eyes that glowed. Many said he made a loud squeal or scream noise, and of course many reported he would glide after cars without moving his wings, and all reported that he was mostly in the TNT area. A real debate began in Point Pleasant about the Mothman, but it was not if he was real or not. That had already been decided in their minds. The debate amongst the Point Pleasant people was whether he was there for good or for evil purposes. Some were calling him a monster or a demon, while others were hoping he was an angel or an omen of good things to come. On November 16th, 1966, there was a much closer encounter with this being, and this encounter would be much different than any of the others so far. Marcella Bennett was visiting the house of a friend who lived near the igloos off Highway 62. While driving down the road, she observed a slow-moving red light above the TNT plant. As she pulled into her friend's house, she stated that it appeared that she thought she woke someone up laying in the yard. She thought it was strange that there was a man laying in the yard, but she thought it was a man wearing gray or tan khakis. But then she saw the red eyes. She stated he was huge and appeared to have grayish or brown feathers, but that he had the face of a man and with huge wings like an angel's wings. She took off running toward the house in such haste that she fell down while carrying her baby daughter, injuring her. She actually fell on top of her daughter, and she remembers being in such fear that she was laying on top of her daughter, knowing that she was hurt, but she couldn't move. Finally, she was able to get up and get into the house, and they locked the doors. And as they were calling the police, the being came onto the front porch and was looking into the windows. He didn't seem to be aggressive, but curious. And everyone in the house witnessed this creature or being peering in window after window, walking calmly to the next window, and then peering in. Of course, they were in panic inside. By the time the police got there, he was gone. But they had gotten to see the Mothman longer and closer than anyone else. And multiple witnesses in the house confirmed that this was no bird, that it was almost human, but it had wings and feathers, but not on his face. The face was dark gray, but the face of a man, but with glowing red eyes.